The forge never went cold. This was deliberate. Thanos had designed it that way, had built the temperature regulation into the fortress's foundational architecture before he built anything else, because he had learned, across 30 years of work that had taken him to the edges of the known universe and back, that the most dangerous thing a mind like his could do was stop. Stopping was the province of beings who had doubts. Doubts were the province of beings who had not looked clearly at the evidence. He had looked clearly at the evidence. He had done so at 7 years old on a dying Titan, while the council laughed at his calculations. And the laughter had taught him something more valuable than any agreement could have. That clarity was its own authority, that the universe did not require consensus to operate according to its own logic, and that the only thing standing between a problem and its solution was the willingness to do what the solution required. He had always been willing. The first gauntlets remains lay on the workbench beside the new construction, not as a trophy, not as a reminder of failure, because Thanos did not organize his interior life around the concept of failure in the way that lesser minds did. It lay there as data, as the physical record of a structural weakness he had not anticipated and would not fail to anticipate again. The crack ran through the mounting junction with the specific, clean geometry of a stress fracture produced by repeated concentrated impact at the same location, not random, not chaotic, not the result of overwhelming force applied broadly. Targeted, intelligent, the work of someone who had analyzed the structure and found its load-bearing point and hit it with the precise, compounding logic of a mind that understood engineering as well as combat. He had not expected that. He did not make a habit of not expecting things. The new gauntlet's mounting was different. He had spent the first 2 weeks after Wakanda on the mounting alone, on the specific junction point that had failed, redesigning it from the foundational level with the comprehensive attention of someone who understood that the detail that had defeated him once was the detail that required the most complete rethinking. The new junction distributed stress across 7 contact points rather than 1, each one independently load-bearing. The system was designed so that damaging any individual point strengthened the load distribution across the remaining 6 rather than propagating fracture. To crack this gauntlet at the mounting, you would need to hit all 7 points simultaneously. He had also spent considerable time on the Kai dampening arrays. The Kai, the energy the two Saiyans generated from within, the biological expression of something the universe's architecture had no category for, had been the variable he had least accounted for at Wakanda. This was, in the context of 30 years of meticulous preparation, an almost incomprehensible oversight, and he sat with the discomfort of that assessment without flinching, because flinching was not something he permitted himself. He had not known Kai existed. He had not known Universe 7 existed. He had not known that a spirit bomb could tear a dimensional membrane and deposit 2 warriors from outside this universe's rule, set into the middle of his most precisely calculated engagement. He knew now. The dampening arrays were built into the gauntlet's internal architecture rather than deployed as external systems, woven through the stone housings themselves, calibrated to the specific Kai frequencies he had captured during Wakanda's engagement. Not to eliminate Kai. He had considered that and dismissed it as both technically impossible and tactically counterproductive. A dampening system strong enough to eliminate Kai entirely would require stone energy that was better deployed elsewhere. What the arrays were designed to do was limit, to create a ceiling, to compress the Kai output of anyone within the gauntlet's effective range to a level that reduced them from an existential variable to a manageable threat. He had also, most importantly, redesigned the tactical approach entirely. At Wakanda, he had arrived at the engagement's conclusion at the moment of the snap and encountered the two Saiyans simultaneously, which had allowed them to function as a unit, father and son, operating in the specific complementary rhythm of people who had fought beside each other for decades, the father's instinct and the son's intellect forming a combination that his single-point strategy had not been designed to address. The combination had cracked the gauntlet. The new strategy addressed the combination by eliminating it before the engagement reached the gauntlet. He would separate them. Not through force. He had modeled force-based separation, and the modeling had returned insufficient results across every variable, because force-based separation required one of them to be neutralized, and neutralizing either of them required a level of stone engagement that left the gauntlet vulnerable during the period of maximum output. The separation needed to happen before the engagement began, before they had the opportunity to orient toward each other and establish the complementary rhythm that made them more than the sum of their individual capability. He would use the space stone, not as a weapon, as a wall. The dimensional pocket the space stone could create, a localized reality bubble, geometrically isolated from the surrounding space, was not a prison in any conventional sense. It was a separation, a pocket of space that occupied the same location as the primary engagement, but was dimensionally offset by precisely the interval required to prevent Kai-based detection between the two Saiyans. Gohan is inside the pocket, Goku outside it. Neither was able to sense the other. Neither was able to function as the unit that had defeated him. The father alone, the son alone. Then he would deal with them in sequence. He set the sixth stone, the Mind Stone, into its housing with the deliberate, ceremonial precision of a craftsman completing a work that represented everything his skill could produce. The housing accepted it. The integration matrix cycled through its startup sequence, and the 6 stones blazed simultaneously for the first time in the new gauntlet, each one finding its connection to the others through the redesigned mounting system, the power flowing between them with the smooth, integrated efficiency of a system that had been built to eliminate the failure modes of its predecessor. He raised the gauntlet, held it in the cold light of the dead system's distant dwarf star. 6 stones, complete, integrated, built around every variable he had failed to account for at Wakanda, redesigned from the foundation to address every weakness the first engagement had revealed. He had been wrong once. He did not intend to be wrong again. 6 weeks had passed since Wakanda, 6 weeks in which the universe had continued its trajectory toward the resource depletion and ecological collapse that his calculations had always predicted with perfect, remorseless accuracy. 6 weeks in which the beings who called themselves Earth's mightiest heroes had presumably been doing what heroes always did after surviving something that should have ended them. Celebrating, recovering, believing the danger had passed because the immediate crisis had resolved. He did not celebrate, he did not recover, he did not believe. He recalculated. And the recalculation had produced this, the gauntlet blazing in the cold light, every weakness addressed, every variable accounted for, the strategy rebuilt from the ground up around the 2 beings who had changed his equation at Wakanda and whom he would not allow to change it again. He thought about the father, Son Goku. The name had come from the dimensional residue the Space Stone had captured during the Wakanda engagement, fragments of language, fragments of identity, the traces that beings left in the dimensional fabric when they moved through it at the speed Goku moved. Saiyan, the last of a warrior race, or one of the last, the data was incomplete. A fighter of extraordinary instinct who had spent his entire life organizing his existence around the act of combat with the specific, uncomplicated joy of someone for whom the fight was not a means to an end but the end itself, who had stood in front of a power stone blast and gotten back up, who had told him, across a Wakandan battlefield, in a voice entirely free of performance or strategy, that they needed to talk. He thought about the Son Gohan, half Saiyan, scholar, the structural threat, the one who had analyzed the gauntlet and found the load-bearing point and hit it 4 times in 2 seconds with the compounding precision of a mind that understood both engineering and violence and had learned, somewhere in the combination of those two things, how to apply one to the other with devastating effectiveness, who had absorbed a full power stone blast and stood back up, who had looked at his father in a Wakanda crater and found the specific steadiness of someone who had decided that steadiness was the only option available. The combination of those two things, instinct and intellect, joy and grief, the father who fought because fighting was what he was, and the son who fought because the people he loved needed him to, was the variable that had broken his first gauntlet. He had built the second one to break that variable first. He lowered the gauntlet. He looked at the forge, at the work that had occupied 6 weeks and every calculation he possessed and every lesson Wakanda had taught him, at the cold light of the dead star through the fortress walls, at the universe beyond it, continuing its trajectory, indifferent to his timeline, producing the same evidence his calculations had always produced in the same quantities they had always produced it. He was not angry. Anger was the province of beings who had expected something different and been disappointed. He had not expected Wakanda to be easy. He had expected it to be the end. It had not been the end. It had been a lesson, and he had always been a good student, and the lesson was now incorporated into the design of everything he was about to do. He activated the boom tube. The violet-edged aperture opened in the fortress wall with the clean, geometrically precise quality that the space stone produced when operated by a hand that fully understood its potential. Beyond it, 1,700 light-years away by conventional measurement, and approximately 1 step away by the stone's reckoning, a compound sat in morning light on a pale blue planet in the Milky Way. He stepped through. He was not rushing. He never rushed. 6 weeks was enough time to learn the shape of a universe that wasn't yours. Not to belong to it, belonging was a different thing, a slower thing, the accumulated sediment of years and shared history, and the specific, irreplaceable texture of a place that had been home long enough to stop requiring conscious identification as such. 6 weeks was not enough for that. But it was enough to learn the particular quality of the light at different hours, the way the compound's eastern field smelled after rain, the specific acoustic signature of the building at 4 in the morning, when most of its occupants were sleeping, and the ones who weren't had found their corners and their silences and their private versions of waiting for the next thing. Goku had learned all of this without trying to learn it, because Goku had always absorbed the texture of places the way he absorbed everything, completely, unself-consciously, without the intermediary step of deciding what to pay attention to. He paid attention to everything. He remembered everything. He had been doing it since childhood on a planet that was not his birth planet, raised by a man who had found him in a forest and decided, with the uncomplicated generosity of someone who did not consult the complications before making important decisions, that the small alien child with the tail was his grandson. He thought about Grandpa Gohan sometimes, in the eastern courtyard at 4 in the morning. Not with grief. Grief was not the primary register of Goku's interior life, had never been, partly by temperament and partly by a lifetime of loss that had taught him that the dead stayed present in the ways that mattered and that organizing your living around their absence was a choice rather than an inevitability. He thought about him with the specific, warm clarity of someone accessing a memory that had worn smooth with handling, that had been returned to so many times it had acquired a particular quality of aliveness. The large hands, the smell of the house, the patience that had never been depleted by the fact of raising something that wasn't entirely human and didn't know it yet. He thought, this is what it is to be somewhere you didn't choose and find anyway, that it has things worth staying for. He had been training every morning for 6 weeks. Not with the Avengers, with the field, with the air, with the specific resistance of a universe whose physics he was still calibrating to, the way a musician calibrates to a new instrument. The MCU's physics were not his universe's physics. The differences were subtle, not dramatic enough to affect his power output in any measurable way, not significant enough to constitute the kind of limitation that required strategic accounting, but present. The way gravity distributed differently in certain atmospheric conditions. The way Kai interfaced with this universe's ambient energy at frequencies that were slightly offset from what he was accustomed to. The way instant transmission worked was slightly different cost here, as though the dimensional fabric was a fraction thicker, and the technique was spending more to cover the same distance. He had been mapping these differences with the patient, comprehensive attention of someone who understood that the gap between what you knew and what you needed to know was the gap that got you killed on a bad day. He had also been training with Steve Rogers. This had surprised him more than almost anything else about the 6 weeks. Not the training itself. He trained with anyone who was willing, had always found that the most interesting things happened at the boundaries between different fighting traditions, that the friction of encountering a style that operated from completely different foundational principles was more instructive than any amount of same-style sparring. What had surprised him was Steve. Steve Rogers did not have powers in any sense that Goku's understanding of power recognized. He had the serum, the physical enhancement, the strength and speed that placed him well above human baseline, but placed against the scale of beings Goku routinely encountered, these were modest assets. What Steve had instead was something that Goku had spent his entire life understanding in one form, and had encountered in Steve in a form that was entirely its own thing. The specific, absolute, non-negotiable refusal to stop. Not stubbornness, not ego, not the performance of toughness for an audience. The genuine, foundational unwillingness to identify the stopping point, to locate the moment at which quitting became a reasonable option and choose it. Goku had that quality, had always had it. Had encountered it in other fighters across his life, in Vegeta most ferociously, in Piccolo with the particular quality of someone who had chosen it rather than been born with it, in Gohan, who had inherited it and then built something more complicated on top of it. In Steve, it existed without complication, without ego, without the layer of pride or ambition or competitive drive that usually accompanied it in the beings Goku knew. Steve Rogers refused to stop because stopping, to him, was simply not a behavior that belonged in the category of available options, and the absence of it from his behavioral repertoire was so complete that it had never occurred to him to miss it. Goku found this, quietly and without making a large thing of it, one of the most impressive things he had ever encountered. He had told Steve this one morning in the Eastern Field. Steve had been quiet for a moment. Then, "You're the first person who's ever said that to me and meant something different than you're stubborn." "You are stubborn," Goku said, "but that's not what I meant." Steve had looked at him with the patient, evaluating attention that was his characteristic mode of processing unexpected information. "What did you mean?" Goku had thought about it. He was not always good at translating his understanding of things into language. He had never been, had spent his life more comfortable with the direct experience of things than with the verbal construction of what the experience meant. But he had tried because Steve deserved the try. "I meant that you've decided what you are," he said finally. "Not what you can do, what you are. And that doesn't change based on what's in front of you." He paused. "That's rarer than power. I've met a lot of powerful people. I haven't met many people who have figured out what they are." Steve had been quiet for a long time after that. They had kept training. Gohan's 6 weeks had looked different. He had spent them in 2 places simultaneously. In the lab with Bruce, where the work on Kai energy theory had grown from preliminary sketches into something that was beginning to have genuine predictive capability. And inside himself, in the particular interior territory that he had been navigating since he was a child and had never fully mapped. The territory of his own power, the question of what it was for. He had always had more power than he knew what to do with. This was the central fact of his existence, the thing around which everything else had organized itself, the inheritance that had arrived before he understood inheritance, the capability that had exceeded his father's before he had reached adolescence, the raw potential that had always been larger than the life he was trying to build with it. He had spent his adult years choosing the life over the power, choosing books and teaching and victual and pan, choosing the smaller, more specific, more genuinely personal version of a life that had been offered to him as an alternative to the cosmic, the legendary, the endlessly escalating sequence of threats that his power level suggested was his destiny. He did not regret those choices. But 6 weeks in a universe that had tested every version of himself he possessed, the scholar, the teacher, the father, the fighter, had clarified something he had been circling for years without landing on it directly. The choice between life and the power had always been presented as a binary, as a selection between two mutually exclusive options, and he had organized a significant portion of his interior architecture around that binary's maintenance. Power over there, life over here. A wall between them, carefully maintained. Wakanda had put a crack in the wall. Not in the gauntlet sense. In the sense that the thing he had accessed in that Wakandan crater, the power he had pulled from the specific, total, non-negotiable refusal to let his father be the last man standing while he still had anything left, had not come from the fighter side of the wall. It had come from the father's side. It had come from Pan's eyes and Vittel's face, and the memory of his mother telling him once, with the fierce, undecorated honesty she brought to everything, "You are your father's son whether you train or not, Gohan. The only question is what you do with it." He had been thinking about what to do with it. Bruce had noticed in the careful, lateral way Bruce noticed things, approaching observations about people from angles that didn't feel like observation, presenting them as questions rather than statements, leaving space around them for the person to respond or not as they chose. "You're not afraid of it anymore," he had said one afternoon in the lab. Not a question, not quite a statement, something in between. Gohan had looked up from the frequency analysis he was running. "The power." "The whole thing," Bruce said. "The power, the fighting, he gestured, and the gesture carried more than it was designed to carry, the specific weight of a man who had spent years at war with his own capability, who had built his entire life around the management and containment of something he experienced as fundamentally dangerous, who understood the interior geography of that war in a way that most people who hadn't lived it couldn't access. The part of you that's very good at this." Gohan was quiet for a moment. "I don't think I'm afraid of it," he said carefully. "I think I've stopped treating fear as the reason not to use it." Bruce had looked at him for a long time. "Yeah," he said quietly, "that's the whole thing, isn't it?" It was on the morning of the 43rd day that Goku stopped mid-form in the eastern courtyard. He had been running through a Kai control sequence, one of the foundational exercises Wise had given him years ago, the kind of training that operated below the level of power output and worked instead on the precision of deployment, on the specific, delicate question of how much and where, and when rather than the cruder question of how much total. He had been running it at half attention, the way he ran things that his body had absorbed deeply enough to execute without full cognitive engagement, which left the other half of his attention free to extend outward into the universe the way it did every morning. He stopped. Not gradually, completely. The Kai sequence suspended mid-motion, his body held in perfect stillness with the specific quality of a system that has received input that overrides all other processing. He stood like that for 4 seconds. Then he lowered his hands. He turned toward the compound's main building with the unhurried, purposeful movement of someone who has received news and has already completed the first stage of responding to it before the news has finished being news. Gohan was in the lab. He looked up when Goku appeared in the doorway, looked up and saw his father's expression, and closed his notebook and stood in one motion, because Gohan had been reading his father's expressions for 30 years, and the one currently on Goku's face did not require a second look to interpret. "It's done," Gohan said. "Just now," Goku said, "I felt the last stone seat. He met his son's eyes. He's coming today." The words landed in the lab with the specific weight of things that have been anticipated long enough to develop a familiar shape and are still, when they arrive, heavier than the anticipation prepared you for. Gohan felt the weight of it, felt it fully, without flinching, without the managed distance he had maintained through 6 weeks of waiting. Let it be what it was. Let the fear be present alongside the readiness, because the fear and the readiness were not opposites and never had been. He looked at the frequency analysis on the display. At the 6 weeks of work accumulated on the lab's surfaces, the notebooks, the calculations, the theoretical framework that was still incomplete and would remain incomplete for months, the record of everything he and Bruce had learned about Kai energy and its interface with this universe's fundamental architecture. He thought about Pan. He thought about Videl. He thought about his mother at Mount Paozu, in the specific afternoon light that fell across that particular piece of ground. He thought, this is what the power is for. Not as an abstract, not as a philosophical position arrived at through deliberation and the weighing of options, as the simple, undecorated fact of a man standing in a lab in a universe not his own, 30 years of choosing the life over the power arriving finally at the moment where the two things were not in opposition, because they had never actually been in opposition, and what had looked like a binary had always been a single thing waiting for him to stop treating it as two. He picked up his notebook, set it on Bruce's workbench, looked at his father. "Steve," he said, "we need to tell Steve." "Already sent him a message," Goku said, holding up the small communicator Tony had provided in the 3rd week. He looked at it with the expression of a man who had mastered the device's operation and maintained ongoing philosophical reservations about the size of the buttons. "He's calling everyone in." Gohan looked at his father. At the communicator, at the eastern field visible through the lab window, the field that had been rebuilt twice and was currently intact and would, in all probability, not remain intact past the end of the day. How long? Goku's eyes went distant, the specific quality of distance that happened when he was extending his Kai sense outward, reading the universe the way other people read rooms. "He's not rushing," he said, "but he's close. Hours, maybe less." "Then we need to be ready in less." "Yeah." Goku pocketed the communicator, looked at his son with the full, open attention that was his most characteristic expression. No performance, no strategy, no distance between the looking and what the looking meant. "You good?" Gohan looked back at him. 6 weeks in a universe that wasn't his. 6 weeks of training and theory, and the slow, patient work of understanding what his power was for, and who he was when he was allowed to be all of it simultaneously. 6 weeks of being a father from 1700 light years away, of thinking about Pan's eyes in the afternoon light, of sitting with the weight of love that couldn't be set down, because setting it down would mean setting down the thing that made everything else worth doing. 6 weeks of being his father's son in a universe where that meant something new, where it was tested against threats that operated at scales their home universe had not prepared them for, where the combination of instinct and intellect and the specific, total, non-negotiable love of two people for each other had cracked a gauntlet that 6 infinity stones hadn't been able to protect. "Yeah," Gohan said, "I'm good." Goku smiled, the full smile. "Then let's go," he said. They walked out of the lab together, into the compound corridor, into the morning light coming through the east-facing windows in the flat, honest quality that showed things as they were. Behind them, on Bruce's workbench, the notebook sat open to the last page Gohan had written on. At the top of the page, in careful, precise handwriting, what comes next? Below it, one line. Everything. In the Situation Room, Steve Rogers was already at the table with the specific, forward-leaning posture of a man who had been waiting for this and had stopped pretending he hadn't. He looked up when Goku and Gohan entered, read their expressions, nodded once. "Tell me what you know," he said. And they did. Thanos arrived without announcement. No forewarning in the compound's sensor arrays. No atmospheric disturbance was detectable by any instrument Tony had installed across 6 weeks of increasingly paranoid perimeter upgrades. No Kai signature that Goku could read approaching from a distance, because the new Gauntlet's dampening arrays were not merely designed to suppress Kai output. They were designed to suppress Kai detection, to create around Thanos a bubble of sensory silence that operated at the same frequencies Goku used to read the universe, that spoke the language of his perception, and told it, fluently and convincingly, that there was nothing here worth attending to. The first warning was the boom tube itself. It opened at 11:23 in the morning in the center of the compound's main courtyard, and the specific quality of its opening was different from the boom tubes Goku had seen at Wakanda. Those had been functional, purposeful apertures deployed with the economy of a strategist who valued efficiency over effect. This one was deliberate, wide, held open for 3 full seconds before Thanos stepped through it, the violet-edged aperture blazing with space stone energy at a level that lit the entire courtyard and threw hard shadows from every surface, and made the compound sensor arrays file simultaneous alerts across every monitoring system Tony had running. 3 seconds was long enough for everyone in the compound to know exactly where he was. That was the point. Thanos stepped through the boom tube and stood in the courtyard in the morning light, and looked at the compound with the patient, comprehensive attention of someone who had arrived at a destination he had been traveling toward for 6 weeks, and was taking a moment to confirm that the destination was what the planning had suggested it would be. His eyes moved across the building's facade, across the perimeter, across the eastern field where the grass was still recovering from the most recent training session's collateral damage, across the assembled figures emerging from the compound's various entry points in response to the sensor alerts. Steve first, because Steve was always first, moving with the controlled urgency of a soldier who had learned to run toward things rather than away from them so long ago that the direction had become instinct rather than choice. Then Tony, the Mark L assembling around him, mid-stride with the fluid, practiced efficiency of a suit that had been deployed in emergencies so many times it had optimized the sequence down to the irreducible minimum. Natasha from the north entrance, Wanda from the east, Bruce cycling through the internal argument he had been losing for 6 weeks about whether the Hulk was going to show up today. The argument that everyone around him had learned to read in the specific quality of his breathing, and the way his hands opened and closed at his sides. Goku and Gohan came through the main entrance together. Thanos found them immediately. His eyes moved past Steve and Tony, and the others with the specific, deliberate economy of a mind that had already cataloged the room and identified the variables that required his attention, and settled on the 2 Saiyans with the focused, unblinking attention of someone conducting the final confirmation of a calculation that had been running for 6 weeks. He looked at Goku. He looked at Gohan. Something moved in his expression, not satisfaction, because satisfaction implied an emotional relationship with outcomes that Thanos had excised from himself long ago. Something more precise. The specific, internal quality of a plan is encountering its intended conditions and finding them accurate. "You felt the gauntlet complete," he said. Not a question. He had built the dampening arrays to suppress Kai detection, but he had also understood, had incorporated into his modeling, that Goku's sensitivity operated at a level that the arrays might not fully contain at close range. He had accounted for this. The timing of his arrival assumed Goku had felt the completion, assumed the compound was at maximum readiness. He had come anyway because maximum readiness was exactly the condition his new strategy was designed to engage. "Yeah," Goku said. His aura was burning at low levels, not suppressed, not held back, simply present, the way a fire burns when it has fuel and oxygen and no particular reason to be more than what it currently is. New gauntlet looks solid. It is, Thanos said. We're going to crack it again, Goku said. No bravado, no performance. The same uncomplicated certainty he brought to every statement of intention, the certainty of someone who had decided what was going to happen and was informing the relevant parties as a courtesy. Thanos looked at him for a moment. No, he said, you are not. He raised the gauntlet. What happened next happened in less than 2 seconds, and in the gap between the gauntlet rising and the compound fully processing the specific configuration of stone activation it was witnessing, the strategy was already 3/4 complete. The space stone blazed. Not at Goku, not at the assembled Avengers, not at any target in the courtyard that a tactical model built around the previous engagement would have predicted. At Gohan. The dimensional pocket opened around him with the geometric precision of a mathematical proof, not a cage, not a cell, not anything that looked like imprisonment because it didn't need to look like imprisonment. It was a separation. A bubble of dimensionally offset space that enclosed Gohan completely, that occupied the same physical location as the courtyard, but existed at a frequency removed from it by exactly the interval required to prevent Kai-based detection from functioning across the boundary. From inside the pocket, Gohan could see the courtyard, could see his father, could see Thanos, could see the engagement beginning without him, with the specific, agonizing clarity of someone watching through glass they cannot break. From outside the pocket, Goku could not feel him. The connection, the Kai-based awareness of each other's presence and power and location that had operated between them as a continuous, unconscious background signal for 30 years, went silent, not gradually, completely. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, the specific frequency that had always told Goku where his son was and how he was, and whether he needed anything went from present to absent with the absolute, total quality of a light being switched off in a room that had never been dark before. Goku stopped. The stopping lasted perhaps a quarter of a second, the quarter second of a system encountering input it has no prior category for, and taking the minimum time required to construct one. Then he turned fast, his Kai sense extending outward in every direction simultaneously with the desperate, searching quality of someone reaching for something that should be there, and finding only the specific shape of its absence. Gohan. He cannot hear you, Thanos said. The dimensional offset operates in both directions. Your Kai cannot penetrate the pocket boundary. He cannot penetrate it outward. He lowered the gauntlet hand slightly, the gesture of a craftsman indicating completed work. He is unharmed. He will remain unharmed as long as the engagement proceeds correctly. A pause. I have no interest in killing your son, Goku. I have an interest in removing the variable that cracked my first gauntlet before this engagement reaches the point at which that variable becomes relevant. Goku turned back to face him. The expression on his face was something Thanos' modeling had accounted for, had specifically built around, had treated as the central challenge of the new strategy rather than its obstacle. The separation was designed precisely for this moment. The moment when Goku processed the absence of his son, and the processing produced the specific, total, ferocious quality of a Saiyan who has had something taken from him. Not rage, rage was unfocused, rage scattered. Rage was the enemy of the precise and compounding Kai output that had driven the Wakanda engagement to its unexpected conclusion. What Thanos had modeled was grief. Grief-focused, grief-directed, grief weaponized by the specific psychology of a being for whom love had always been the primary fuel of power. He had built the dampening arrays for grief-fueled Kai. He had calibrated them specifically to the frequency that Goku's power signature occupied when operating from emotional rather than tactical motivation. The signature captured at Wakanda when Goku had called his son's name across the battlefield, and the power had spiked in the specific register of a parent reaching toward a child in danger. The arrays cycled to that frequency now. "Fight me," Thanos said. "That is what you want. That is what you came prepared to do." He raised the gauntlet to full engagement position. "Fight me and fight well, and perhaps you will find a way through what I have built." The 6 stones blazed in their housings, integrated, concurrent, running at full simultaneous output for the first time in the engagement. Or accept that this universe requires what it requires, and that your arrival has not changed the equation as fundamentally as Wakanda suggested. Goku looked at him. The look had something in it that Thanos' modeling had not fully captured, had approximated, had accounted for in general terms, but had not rendered with complete accuracy. Because modeling Goku required modeling the specific, irreducible quality of a being who had always been most dangerous, not when he was angry or grieving or motivated by the emotional fuel that most fighters peaked on, but when he was clear. When the noise had settled and the situation had declared itself, and what remained was the pure, unencumbered orientation of someone who had found the next thing and was simply, completely present to it. Goku was clear. "The pocket," he said, "Space Stone, he's fully inside it." The question was not directed at Thanos. Steve, 15 feet to Goku's left, answered it with the clipped precision of a soldier in the middle of an engagement. "Full enclosure. I can see him through the boundary. He looks like he's trying to." The dimensional pocket flared. Inside it, Gohan had spent the first 10 seconds of his enclosure running the same rapid, comprehensive assessment he ran every situation that required it. Not because he needed 10 seconds to understand what had happened. He had understood within the first 2. But because the discipline of complete assessment before response was one of the things his intellect had always provided as a counterweight to the part of him that wanted to respond immediately and with maximum force to the specific. Intolerable sensation of being separated from his father by something he couldn't punch through. He could see the courtyard through the pocket boundary. He could see his father turning to face Thanos with an expression that he recognized, and that made something tighten in his chest with the specific, helpless quality of watching someone he loved walk into something dangerous from behind glass. He could see Thanos raising the gauntlet. He could not feel his father's Kai. The silence where that connection should have been was the most disorienting sensation he had experienced since arriving in this universe. Not painful in any physical sense, but fundamentally wrong in the way that the absence of a sense you've never consciously used is wrong. In the way that losing something you'd never had to think about keeping reveals how entirely it had organized everything else around itself. He pressed his hands against the pocket boundary. The boundary was not physical. It had no surface, no texture, no material to push against. It was a dimensional condition, a state of the space he was occupying rather than a thing inserted into that space. Pressing against it was less like pushing on a wall and more like pushing on the concept of direction. It was there, and it resisted, and the resistance was not mechanical but fundamental, the resistance of a rule rather than a substance. His Kai flared. The pocket boundary absorbed the output with the dispassionate efficiency of something that had been designed specifically for this, that had been calibrated to the Kai frequencies Gohan operated at by someone who had spent 6 weeks studying the Wakanda engagement data and had arrived at very accurate numbers. The boundary didn't crack, didn't stress, processed the Kai, and maintained its integrity with the same unperturbed consistency it would have maintained against a fraction of the output. He stepped back, closed his eyes. The scholar's mind ran the problem with the specific, focused speed of someone who had been doing this, finding the solution in the structure of the constraint rather than in the force applied against it, since graduate school. The pocket was a dimensional offset, space stone technology. The boundary was maintained by the stone's active output, not a passive structure but a continuously generated condition, requiring ongoing energy investment from the gauntlet to sustain. Which meant it had a generator. Which meant it had a frequency. which meant that if the frequency could be matched from the inside, if Gohan could generate a Kai output that resonated at the exact frequency the Space Stone was using to maintain the boundary's dimensional offset, the resonance would not break the boundary by force. It would destabilize it. The way a precisely tuned frequency destabilizes a glass, not by hitting it harder than the glass can withstand, but by vibrating at the specific frequency that the glass's own structure is organized around, and introducing an interference pattern that the structure cannot maintain against. He had written a paper on resonance frequency interference in his second year of graduate school. He had thought at the time that it was a physics paper. He opened his eyes. He looked at the boundary, extended his Kai sense outward, not through the boundary. That was what the dampening was for, but across the boundary's surface, feeling its texture at the level of frequency rather than force, looking for the specific oscillation that the Space Stone's output was using to maintain the dimensional offset. It was there. Subtle, calibrated to resist detection as well as penetration. Thanos had thought of this, had built the boundary to be opaque to Kai sensing as well as Kai force. But Kai sensing was not a single frequency operation. Goku had taught him that, years ago, in the way that Goku taught everything, not through instruction but through demonstration, through the lived example of someone whose sensitivity operated across a spectrum broad enough to find things that weren't where they were supposed to be. Gohan broadened his Kai sense, cast it across every frequency simultaneously, the wide, dispersed, attention of everything scan rather than the focused attention of one thing search. Let it wash across the boundary without looking for anything specific, without the directed intention that the dampening was designed to block. And found it. Not the boundary itself. The gap in the boundary, the specific frequency interval at the boundary's edge, where the Space Stone's output had a natural harmonic null, a point where the dimensional offset's maintenance wave canceled itself momentarily before resetting. It happened at a rate of approximately 40 cycles per second. At each cancellation, for a duration of less than a millisecond, the boundary's coherence dropped fractionally. But fractionally was enough. He would need to hit it at exactly the right frequency, at exactly the right moment in the cancellation cycle, with exactly the right Kai output to introduce a resonance interference that the boundary couldn't recover from before the next cycle. It would not break the pocket immediately. It would introduce a degradation that compounded across cycles, each cancellation hit with the resonance frequency, making the next cancellation slightly longer, the boundary slightly less coherent, until the degradation reached the threshold at which the Space Stone's active output could no longer compensate for the structural interference. He estimated 20 seconds. In the courtyard, his father had 20 seconds to survive alone against a completed 6-stone gauntlet. He began. Outside the pocket, the engagement had found its rhythm, the brutal, uncompromising rhythm of a fight between two beings for whom the word overwhelming was a relative term that required significant contextual qualification. Thanos pressed the advantage of the gauntlet's full concurrent operation with the methodical, escalating precision of someone executing a plan that had been modeled for 6 weeks and was performing within acceptable parameters. The Power Stone's output was calibrated to keep Goku moving, to prevent him from establishing the stable platform that instant transmission required, to force reactive defense rather than offensive engagement, to wear him down rather than defeat him through any single decisive exchange. It was working. Not completely. Nothing worked completely against Goku, which was one of the central findings of Wakanda's data and a factor Thanos had built into his modeling, but sufficiently. Each Power Stone blast drove Goku back. Each Space Stone manipulation bent his approach vectors away from the gauntlet hand. Each Reality Stone deployment turned his most effective combinations into something the environment simply refused to support. The local physics, rewritten in real time to eliminate the specific conditions his technique required. The time stone waited, deployed once briefly to reverse a combination that had gotten through the defenses and landed solidly on the gauntlet hand. Landed and not cracked, not this time. The reinforced mounting absorbing the impact across its 7 distribution points and returning only a stress reading rather than a fracture. Goku felt the time stone's reversal. Adjusted. The combination he threw the second time was not the same combination. It was a different combination using the information the first combination had generated. The data of the first attempt informed the second with the specific, rapid cycle learning of a fighter who processed every exchange as both a contest and an education. The second combination did not target the mounting. It targeted the stone housings themselves, the individual casings that seated each stone in the gauntlet's matrix, smaller than the mounting, harder to hit but less reinforced because the reinforcement design had focused on the junction point that had failed at Wakanda. The reality stone housing cracked. A hairline, barely visible. Thanos felt it, felt the specific, microscopic feedback of a component that had absorbed more impact than its design tolerance accommodated, and had responded by beginning to fail. And the power stone came up immediately. A full output blast at close range that was less strategy and more the reflex of a system encountering damage and prioritizing the elimination of the source. Goku took it. Fully, planted his feet and took it with the specific, deliberate choice of someone who had assessed in the fraction of a second available to him that taking it was more valuable than dodging it, that the information about the reality stone housing's location and vulnerability was more important than the cost of the power stone hit, and that the cost, while significant, was within the range his body could absorb and recover from before the next exchange. He hit the ground. Steve's voice came through the compound's external speakers. Tony had patched the comms to the courtyard audio, and Steve was running tactical coordination from the perimeter with the specific, load-bearing usefulness of a man who understood exactly what he could and could not contribute to this engagement, and had organized himself entirely around the former. Reality stone housing. Left side, third from top. Goku heard it. He was already getting up. "Yeah," he said, and the word carried everything. The acknowledgement, the pain that he was not going to spend time on, the orientation toward what came next. He looked at Thanos across the courtyard, at the gauntlet with its hairline crack in the reality stone housing, at the 6 stones running at full concurrent output, the power of them pressing against the morning air with the specific, enormous weight of fundamental forces, operating without the restraint that the first gauntlet's structural failure had introduced. He looked at the space stone housing. At the dimensional pocket, it was maintained. At the specific, continuous energy investment the stone was making to keep Gohan separated, the ongoing output that was not available for offensive deployment, the resource was being spent on the separation strategy rather than the engagement itself. He had been filing this since the pocket opened. The space stone was not fully available for combat application as long as the pocket existed. 5 stones at full concurrent offensive output and 1 stone at continuous defensive deployment. 5 was still catastrophic, but 5 was not 6. He found the geometry of it, the specific, narrow tactical window that the division of the space stone's attention created, the attack angle that the stone's defensive commitment left momentarily unaddressed in the offensive array, and he moved toward it with the full, focused, uninhibited expression of a fighter who had located exactly what he was looking for. The power stone came up to close the window. Thanos was fast, but Goku was faster. He got through, not to the gauntlet hand. The power stone closed the window before he reached the full approach, but to the space adjacent to it, the close-range position that the reality stone housing's location and the space stone's divided attention had made briefly accessible. He hit the Reality Stone housing with a concentrated Kai strike, not the broad, force distribution impact of a combat punch, but the narrow, precise, frequency-targeted output that Gohan's theoretical framework had suggested during one of their lab sessions. The Kai applied not as force, but as resonance, targeted at the specific material frequency of the housing's construction. The hairline crack widened. Not much, but more than it had been. Thanos stepped back. One step, the same single step that Wakanda had produced, the step that had registered on every observer present as something that didn't happen, that had weight precisely because of its rarity. He looked at the Reality Stone housing, at the crack, at Goku, bloodied and burning and already repositioning for the next approach with the specific, complete, inexhaustible orientation toward the next thing that had defined every moment of every fight he had ever been in. And then the dimensional pocket flared white. Not the violet blue of space stone energy. White, the specific, pressurized white of Kai output at a frequency the pocket boundaries dampening arrays had not been calibrated for, because the dampening arrays had been calibrated to the Kai frequencies captured at Wakanda, and what was currently happening inside the pocket was not the Kai Gohan had been using at Wakanda. It was something else. Something that had identified the boundary's harmonic null at 40 cycles per second, and had been hitting it with precisely tuned resonance interference for 19 seconds, and had introduced a degradation that had compounded across cycles, until the space stone's active output could no longer compensate for the structural interference it had introduced. The pocket boundary destabilized. Not gradually. It held and held and held, and then it didn't, the coherence dropping below the maintenance threshold in a single cycle, and the space stone's output scrambling to compensate and finding that the degradation had propagated too far through the boundary's frequency structure for compensation to work faster than the interference was spreading. The pocket collapsed. Gohan stepped out of the space where it had been. His aura ignited. Thanos looked at him, looked at the Reality Stone housing's widening crack, looked at the space stone's output, scrambled and cycling as it attempted to rebuild the pocket from destabilized foundations, consuming the stone's full capacity in the recovery attempt, and leaving nothing available for either defensive or offensive deployment. Ran the calculation. The calculation came back with a result that had a specific quality, the quality of a model encountering real-world conditions that had diverged from its assumptions in ways that were individually accountable and collectively decisive. The Reality Stone housing had not been modeled to fail this quickly. The pocket boundary had not been modeled to be defeated through resonance interference at frequencies below the dampening array's calibration range. The space stone's recovery consumption had not been modeled to remove the stone from concurrent operation at this stage of the engagement. Each divergence was explainable. Together, they had changed the equation. How, Thanos said, not furiously, with the honest, direct quality of a mind encountering a gap in its understanding and identifying the gap with precision. Physics paper, Gohan said. Second year of graduate school. He looked at his father across the courtyard. The Kai connection had returned the moment the pocket collapsed, had snapped back into place with the specific, overwhelming relief of a sense restored after absence, the 30-year background signal of his father's presence and power returning to the frequency where it had always lived. You okay? Better now, Goku said. He was smiling. The full smile. Together, he said. Gohan looked at the gauntlet, at the cracked Reality Stone housing, at the space stone cycling through recovery, at Thanos recalculating the strategy's primary element collapsed and the secondary elements running without the foundation the separation had been designed to provide. Together, he said. His aura blazed white. Goku's blazed gold, deepening through blue, settling into the full expression of Super Saiyan Blue, with the compound sensors registering an output that exceeded every category Tony had established, and several he hadn't. Thanos raised the gauntlet. 4 stones available, 2 compromised. He ran the calculation one more time. The calculation returned the same result it had returned at Wakanda. The result he had spent 6 weeks trying to prevent, had built an entirely new gauntlet to prevent, had designed a separation strategy specifically to prevent. Different. The equation was still different. He had built the gauntlet for 2 Saiyans fighting separately. What stood across the courtyard from him was 2 Saiyans who had never, not once, been the sum of their individual capability, who were, when they were together, something that the sum could not account for, that no calculation built around individual power levels could model, because the thing that made them more than the sum was not quantifiable in any framework that treated power as the primary variable. He raised the gauntlet to full engagement. "Then let us see," he said, "what the equation requires." And Goku and Gohan moved. They moved as one. Not in the synchronized, choreographed sense of fighters who had drilled the same combinations until the muscle memory made thought redundant, though they had that too, had built it across years of training that Gohan had resisted, and then returned to, and then surpassed in ways that had always secretly delighted his father, even when the delight expressed itself primarily as getting hit very hard. They moved as one in the deeper sense, in the sense that the 30-year-old Kai connection between them had always operated at a level below tactical coordination, below the conscious deployment of complementary strategies, below anything that could be planned or modeled or accounted for in a calculation built around individual power outputs. They moved as one in the sense that they were. Goku took the left approach vector, the angle that the reality stone housing's crack made most vulnerable, the geometry that his body had been mapping across the previous exchange, with the continuous, unconscious precision of a fighter who processes spatial information the way other people breathe. His aura blazed blue-gold at full Super Saiyan blue output, no ceiling, no threshold, no containment field required, because the only thing that had ever needed containing was the signal, and the signal was irrelevant now. He moved at the speed that this universe's physics permitted him, which was faster than anything the compound sensors could track and slower than he was in Universe 7, and exactly sufficient for what the next 30 seconds required. Gohan took the right. His approach was different, tighter, more vertical, using the spatial geometry that the Space Stone's recovery consumption had opened by removing the stone from offensive deployment. Where Goku's approach was the river, always moving, always finding the path, Gohan's was the cliff, the commitment of full weight and full force to a single chosen point, the approach that had found the reality stone housing's crack and had found the pocket boundary's harmonic null, and had, at 7 years old on a dying planet, found the frequency at which a wounded Saiyan's grief became something that moved the ground. Thanos engaged both simultaneously. This was the calculation's conclusion, that 4 stones at full concurrent offensive output, even with the reality stone compromised, and the space stone in recovery, represented a defensive and offensive capability sufficient to contain 2 Saiyans whose combined approach required the calculation to account for them as a unit rather than individually. The Power Stone addressed Goku. The Mind Stone addressed Gohan, not with the stone's full capacity. It had never been primarily a weapon, but with the specific capability it possessed that no other stone replicated. The ability to interface directly with consciousness, to reach into the mind of an opponent and find there the specific thing that interrupted function. For most opponents, this was fear. For Gohan, Thanos had calculated it was something else entirely. The Mind Stone's output reached toward Gohan's consciousness with the gentle, precise, devastating touch of a stone that had spent billions of years learning how minds were organized and where their load-bearing structures were. It found in Gohan's mind, the architecture that the 6 weeks of clarity had built, the wall between the life and the power, partially dismantled, the binary revealed as a false binary, the fighter and the father operating from the same foundation rather than competing for the same resources. It found this architecture and it did not attack it, it illuminated it. It showed Gohan, with the specific, comprehensive clarity that only the Mind Stone could produce, every path in which the engagement ended with his father not standing. Not as a threat, not as a manipulation, as information. The cold, complete, actuarial information of every timeline in which what was currently happening ended in a way that left Gohan in a universe not his own, without the one person who had always been the fixed point his existence was oriented around. Gohan felt it. He felt it fully, did not filter it, did not manage it, did not apply the scholar's analytical distance that had always been his primary defense against the things that were too large to hold at arm's length. He felt every one of those timelines with the specific, total quality of someone whose interior architecture had spent 6 weeks dismantling the wall between the fighter and the father, and now had no partition to protect one from the other. He let it be what it was. And then he kept moving. Not because the fear wasn't real, not because the timelines the Mind Stone had shown him were inaccurate or manipulated, or in any way less than the complete, honest, devastating picture they presented themselves as, but because 30 years of being his father's son had taught him something about the relationship between fear and forward movement that no Mind Stone could reach, because it didn't live in the mind. It lived in the place that powered the Kai. He kept moving. Thanos redirected the Power Stone. The blast that followed was not measured, not economical, not the calibrated, resource-conscious deployment of a strategist who understood that excess was a form of inefficiency. It was everything the Power Stone had, the full, unrestrained output of the stone that contained the concept of power itself, directed at the specific target that the calculation had identified as the structural threat, the variable that had cracked the first gauntlet and destabilized the pocket boundary, and was currently approaching the reality stone housing's crack with the precise, compounding focus of someone who had identified the weak point and intended to use it. Gohan did not dodge. He had not dodged the Power Stone blast at Wakanda. He had not dodged it then, because the information that landing the Mind Stone housing strike generated was more valuable than the cost of the hit, and he had made a calculation in the fraction of a second available that the cost was within range. He did not dodge it now because the approach vector he had committed to was the approach vector that the reality stone housing's crack demanded, and abandoning it meant giving the gauntlet time to compensate. Time to rotate the housing away from the line of attack, time to rebuild the defensive geometry that he had spent the entire engagement dismantling one fracture at a time. He took it. The Power Stone's full output hit him like the universe asserting an opinion. He went through the compound's eastern wall. The wall was reinforced. Tony had spent the 3rd week upgrading the structural specifications of every external surface after the first training session with Thor had made the original construction feel aspirational, and it slowed him. Not much. The slowdown was measurable in fractions of a second and immeasurable in any category that the compound structural engineers had prepared the wall to address. He went through it, and through the room behind it, and through the next wall with the specific, unignorable momentum of something that had absorbed a Power Stone blast at full output, and was in the process of distributing the kinetic consequence across whatever surfaces presented themselves. He stopped in the eastern field. In the grass. In the specific, recovering grass of the field that had been rebuilt twice and was currently on its 3rd iteration, and had now absorbed something that the second rebuild specifications had not accounted for. The field was quiet. Gohan lay in it for a moment. Not unconscious, his eyes were open, his aura guttering at its edges but present, the white fire pulling tight to his body in the specific, energy conservation response of a system that had taken maximum damage and was making real-time decisions about where the remaining resources went. He was running an inventory. The inventory was not encouraging in certain categories and adequate in the ones that mattered. He could move. He pressed one hand into the grass. Pushed. Inside the courtyard, Thanos had turned his full attention back to Goku, had done so the moment the Power Stone blast connected, the moment the variable that required maximum resource allocation had been removed from the immediate equation by the blast's consequence. He turned with the efficiency of a calculation updating in real time, the resource investment shifting from the Gohan problem to the Goku problem, with the same precise, unsentimentalized reallocation that characterized everything he did. He found Goku already inside the Gauntlet's hand's reach. Not at the Reality Stone housing, at the Time Stone. The approach had changed between the moment Thanos redirected the Power Stone at Gohan and the moment he turned back to Goku, and the change was not random, and was not desperation, and was not the reactive improvisation of a fighter who had lost his primary plan and was reaching for whatever presented itself. It was the instantaneous strategic reassessment of a mind that had processed the Power Stone's engagement of Gohan, had processed the resource commitment that engagement had required, had processed the Space Stone's ongoing recovery consumption, and had arrived at a new calculation about where the Gauntlet was most vulnerable given the current resource distribution. The Reality Stone housing's crack was the obvious target. Obvious targets were, by definition, defended. The Time Stone housing was not cracked. It was fully intact, fully defended, positioned at the Gauntlet's center where the geometric protection of the surrounding stone housings made approach difficult and a precise strike nearly impossible. But the Time Stone was the stone that had reversed his combination at Wakanda. The stone that had been deployed once in the current engagement to reverse the early combination that had landed on the Gauntlet hand. The stone, whose deployment required a specific, brief window of recalibration after each use during which its defensive output dropped by a fraction that was normally insufficient to matter. Normally, with 3 of the 6 stones compromised or occupied, it normally had stopped. He hit the Time Stone housing. Not with maximum force. Maximum force was not what the situation required, was not what the housing's geometry would benefit from, given the angles available. He hit it with the specific, frequency-targeted Chi output that Gohan's theoretical framework had suggested, the resonance application rather than the force application. The paper from the second year of graduate school, applied to a second housing with the same foundational physics operating at a slightly different frequency. The Time Stone housing cracked. Thanos felt it. And in the moment of feeling it, in the quarter second of the calculation updating to account for a second cracked housing, the Time Stone's defensive output dropping as the housing integrity compromised. Goku was already moving to the next position, already reading the updated geometry of the Gauntlet's defensive array, and finding the new window the Time Stone housing's compromise had opened. The Power Stone came up. Goku moved through the blast. Not dodged, moved through, instant transmission deploying in the fraction of a second between the Power Stone charging and the blast releasing, the technique folding the distance between his current position and the position the blast was heading toward so that the blast arrived at a location he had already left. He arrived on the Gauntlet's opposite side, the side the Power Stone's deployment had momentarily left undefended, and hit the Reality Stone housing with a full-force strike that was not frequency-targeted, and was not resonance-based, and was not the application of any theoretical framework. It was Goku hitting something as hard as he could. The Reality Stone housing didn't crack further. It shattered. The Reality Stone blazed free of its housing, contained within the Gauntlet's matrix by the integration systems, but no longer seated, no longer fully incorporated into the concurrent operation. its output fragmenting and destabilizing as the housing that had channeled and directed it ceased to exist as a coherent structure. The reality stone's destabilization propagated through the integration matrix, with the specific, cascading quality of a system that had been designed for full concurrent operation, encountering a component that had failed catastrophically rather than degradedly. Two stones compromised, one housing destroyed. The power stone swung toward Goku with the full output of a strategist whose resource calculation had just taken a significant loss and was prioritizing the elimination of the source with everything that remained available. Goku did not have time to move. The blast connected. He went the same direction Gohan had gone, through the eastern wall, through the rooms behind it, into the field, and landed in the grass beside his son. The field was quiet. They lay in it together for a moment, father and son, side by side in the recovering grass, both of them running inventories that were arriving at similar conclusions about the current state of their respective systems. Goku's aura was low, not extinguished. The blue gold still burned, tighter and closer to the body than before, the reserves doing the specific, careful arithmetic of a system that has spent significantly and is accounting for what remains. Gohan's white fire was at a similar level. Both of them are breathing. Both of them are present. Goku turned his head to look at his son. "Reality stone housing," he said. "I know," Gohan said. "Time stone housing too." "Two down. Four to go," Gohan said. "Space stone is still in recovery. That's effectively 3 offensive stones." He turned his head to look at the compound wall they had both come through. Power stone, mind stone, soul stone. "Soul stone hasn't been deployed yet," Goku noted. Gohan was quiet for a moment. "That concerns me." "Yeah." Goku pressed his hands into the grass, pushed himself to sit with the deliberate, careful movement of someone conducting a full system restart and being honest about the timeline. "He's saving it." "For what?" "Don't know." Goku looked at the compound, at the hole in the eastern wall through which the morning light was now entering at angles it hadn't been designed for. But he's been precise about everything else. Didn't use anything he didn't need to. He turned to look at Gohan with the clear, direct attention of his characteristic assessment mode, the reading of the situation rather than the reaction to it, the fighter's intelligence operating below the level of the pain his body was reporting and the concern his heart was generating. "He has a plan for the Soul Stone." "He always has a plan," Gohan said. "Yeah," a pause. "What's the Soul Stone do on its own, without the Gauntlet integration?" Gohan looked at him. The analytical engine ran the question with the speed that came from 6 weeks of theoretical work on Infinity Stone mechanics alongside Bruce. On its own, the Soul Stone's primary function is consciousness interface. It connects to the soul, to the fundamental animating principle of living beings. It can extract souls, contain them, reach into the essential nature of a being and interact with it directly. He paused. "It's the only stone that doesn't primarily affect the external world. It affects what's inside." Goku absorbed this. "What's inside a Saiyan," he said slowly, "is the Kai." Gohan looked at him. The realization arrived in both of them simultaneously through different routes. Goku through the fighter's instinct that had always processed tactical information faster than the words to describe it. Gohan through the theoretical framework that had built a model of Kai energy and its interface with this universe's fundamental forces, and had just received a piece of information that the model hadn't previously incorporated. The Soul Stone could interface directly with consciousness. Kai was the expression of consciousness through the body, the biological, living, irreducible expression of what it meant to be a specific person in a specific body with a specific history and specific people worth fighting for. The Soul Stone didn't need to crack a housing or exceed a dampening array or overcome a Kai barrier. It could reach through all of those things. Directly. He's going to try to take the Kai, Gohan said. Not loudly, with the specific, flat quality of a conclusion that has been reached through analysis and is being stated rather than reacted to, because reaction was something that could happen after the statement had been made and the implication had been fully understood. Can it do that? Goku asked. I don't know, Gohan said honestly. Nothing in the theoretical framework has an answer for what happens when the Soul Stone interfaces directly with Kai at the foundational level. The Kai is generated by the living system, by the specific, irreducible fact of being alive and being who you are. The Soul Stone reaching for that is, he stopped, started again. It would be like reaching for the thing that makes you you, not your power, not your capability, the thing underneath. Goku was quiet for a moment. He looked at the sky, at the morning blue of a universe not his own, clear and present, and exactly the color that skis were when they were being honest about what they were. He looked at it with the expression of someone taking a reading of something important before the conditions changed. Okay, he said. Gohan looked at him. Okay. If it reaches for that, Goku turned to look at his son. His expression was clear, completely clear. The way it was clear in the moments when he had arrived at something and the arriving was done, and what remained was simply the thing he'd arrived at, present and without complication. It's going to find something it wasn't expecting. He stood up. His aura blazed. Not the careful, resource-conscious burn of a system managing its reserves. The full expression, every transformation available, the blue deepening through layers that had no formal name in any power classification system, because they represented the specific output of a Saiyan at the absolute convergence of capability and will, the place where what you could do and what you had decided to do became identical. The grass around him flattened in a perfect circle. Gohan stood beside him. His aura blazed white. They walked back through the hole in the eastern wall together. Thanos was waiting in the courtyard. The gauntlet showed 2 destroyed housings and 1 in recovery, 3 stones at full operational capacity, 2 compromised, 1 in reserve. The power stone burned violet-white. The mind stone glowed yellow-green. The soul stone pulsed orange-gold with the slow, deep rhythm of something that had been waiting for this specific moment since the engagement began. He looked at them, at the specific, complete quality of 2 beings who had absorbed everything the gauntlet had deployed, and had come back through the wall with their auras burning, and their orientation unchanged, with the same direction they had arrived with still pointing in the same direction it had been pointing when the boom tube opened. He ran the calculation one final time. It returned the same result. It always returned when these 2 were in the equation. Different. The Soul Stone, Goku said. He had stopped 5 meters from Thanos' close range, inside the effective distance for instant transmission, outside the immediate reach of the gauntlet hand's physical strike. You're going to try it. Yes, Thanos said. No performance, no strategy. Simple, honest confirmation from a being that had always treated accuracy as its primary operating principle, regardless of tactical advantage. What do you think you'll find? Goku asked. Thanos looked at him. The look had the quality of a calculation that had been run many times and had always produced the same answer, and was being run once more in the specific, honest spirit of a mind that remained open to the possibility, however small, that the answer might be different. A power source, he said. Biological in origin, consciousness adjacent, unclassified by this universe's architecture. A variable, he paused. Something that can be contained. Goku nodded slowly. And if it's not a power source? Thanos looked at him. Everything is reducible to power in sufficient analysis. No, Goku said, simply, without argument, the flat, direct negation of someone stating a fact they have checked from every available angle and have confirmed. It's not. The Soul Stone blazed. The output it produced was not the violent, kinetic force of the Power Stone, or the reality-rewriting pulse of the destroyed reality stone, or the consciousness-interrupting reach of the mind stone. The soul stone's output had no color in any conventional sense. It was the orange gold of its resting state amplified to a level that made the color feel less like light and more like presence, like the specific, full-frequency expression of something that was aware in a way that the other stones were not, that was reaching rather than striking, extending rather than impacting, looking for the thing it had been designed to find. It reached toward Goku's Kai. The Kai it found was not a power source. It was not a variable in a calculation. It was a man who had spent his entire life treating every fight as a reason to find out what he was capable of, who had died and died again, and returned again with the same uncomplicated orientation toward the next thing, who had stood between every ending he had ever encountered and the people he was standing between it, and who had a son who was the best thing he had ever had anything to do with, who had a wife who was smarter than him and had always known it and had loved him anyway, who had a home on a planet that was not his birth planet raised by a man who had found him in a forest, and decided without consulting the complications that the small alien child with the tail was worth keeping. It was a man who had opened his Kai completely to a soul stone in a different timeline, and had stood in the courtyard afterward trying to find a memory that wasn't there anymore, and had felt its absence with the specific, clean grief of someone who knew what they had lost, and had no uncertainty about whether the losing had been worth it. It was all of these things simultaneously. Not a power source, not a variable, something the soul stone had never encountered in 14 billion years of this universe's existence, and had no framework for containing because containing required a category. And there was no category for this because the category was specific and irreducible, and could not be separated from the specific person. It belonged to without ceasing to be what it was. The soul stone hesitated. This was not a mechanical event. The soul stone did not hesitate in its operational framework. It had never hesitated, had spent billions of years reaching for the thing it reached for, and taking it with the absolute, unambiguous certainty of something that knew exactly what it was doing. It hesitated in the way that a force hesitates when it encounters a resistance it was not designed to engage, when the thing it reaches for reaches back in a way that the reaching was not designed to accommodate. The Kai reached back, not aggressively, not as a counterattack, with the simple, total, non-negotiable quality of something that was what it was and had no interest in being contained, that existed in the specific, irreducible way that things exist when they are fully themselves, and have stopped spending any energy on being anything else. The soul stone's output fractured. The fracture was not structural, the housing remained intact, and the stone itself was undamaged. The fracture was in the output's coherence, the specific, precise interference pattern that resulted from a force designed to reach into consciousness encountering a consciousness that was, in the relevant sense, exactly as large as the force reaching into it. The interference propagated back through the gauntlet's integration matrix. It hit the mind stone first, the mind stone whose output had been reaching toward consciousness since the engagement began, whose sensitivity to the specific frequencies of awareness made it the most vulnerable to the interference pattern the soul stone's fractured output was generating. The mind stone's housing stressed. A hairline fracture appeared at the junction between the housing and the mounting's third distribution point. Then it hit the power stone. The power stone didn't fracture. The power stone was not sensitive to consciousness interference. It was the stone that contained the concept of power itself, and was about as interested in philosophical interference as a mountain was interested in the opinion of the wind. But the integration matrix's coherence had been disrupted by the soul stone's fractured output and the mind stone's housing fracture, and the power stone's full concurrent operation depended on the matrix's coherence, and the matrix was currently less coherent than it had been 30 seconds ago. The power stone's output dropped. Fractionally, but fractionally, in this engagement, was the only unit of measurement that had ever mattered. Gohan moved. He had been watching the Soul Stone's engagement with the Kai, had been watching it with the specific, full-spectrum Kai sense that his father had demonstrated years ago, and that he had developed his own version of, broader than Goku's in some frequencies and narrower in others. He had felt the Soul Stone reach, had felt the Kai reach back, had felt the interference pattern propagate through the integration matrix, with the specific, resonant quality that his theoretical framework recognized immediately, because it was the same fundamental physics as the pocket boundary's harmonic null. A system encountering a frequency it wasn't designed to process and producing interference rather than function. He moved toward the Mind Stone housing's hairline fracture, with the full expression of beast form blazing white around him. The approach vector the Power Stone's dropped output had opened, the window that the integration matrix's disrupted coherence had created. He hit the Mind Stone housing 4 times in 2 seconds. The same 4 strikes, the same 2 seconds. The same compounding logic that had found the first Gauntlet's load-bearing point at Wakanda, and hit it until the geometry of repeated impact at the same location exceeded the structural tolerance of the housing's material, and the mounting's distribution could no longer compensate. The Mind Stone housing shattered. The Mind Stone blazed free. The integration matrix fractured along 3 separate fault lines simultaneously as 2 stone housings failed in rapid succession, while a third stone's output was still in coherence-disrupted recovery. The gauntlet blazed, not with the controlled, integrated, precisely deployed concurrent output of 6 stones operating as a designed system, but with the chaotic, uncoordinated discharge of a system that had lost its integration architecture and was running on individual stone outputs that had nothing organizing their interaction. Chaos in a completed Infinity Gauntlet was no less dangerous than order. In some ways, it was more dangerous. But chaotic output could not be aimed, and chaotic output could not execute a snap. Thanos looked at the gauntlet, at the 2 destroyed houses, at the fractured integration matrix, at the Soul Stone's incoherent output still cycling through the frequency the Kai had interrupted, at the Power Stone and the Space Stone were running at partial capacity through a disrupted matrix that could no longer coordinate their deployment with the precision the strategy required. He looked at Goku, at the Kai that had reached back into the Soul Stone and had broken its output by being, completely and without remainder, exactly what it was. He looked at Gohan, at the compounding strikes that had found the third housing before the matrix could recover, and had shattered it with the same foundational logic that had cracked the first gauntlet, the logic of a mind that understood structure and found its weak points and applied force not as brute assertion, but as the precise, intelligent exploitation of the specific failure modes built into everything that had ever been built. He ran the calculation. The calculation came back with a result that had never appeared in 30 years of work. Insufficient data. Not defeat, not a result that concluded in favor of one outcome or another. Insufficient data, the specific, unprecedented response of a calculation encountering variables it could not reduce to the terms its framework was built to process, encountering something that existed outside the architecture of everything it had been designed to account for. The gauntlet's chaotic output discharged. The discharge was enormous and uncontrolled, and went in every direction simultaneously, and accomplished nothing because uncoordinated power without aim was the universe making noise rather than the universe being changed. It lit the courtyard in the full, chaotic spectrum of 5 stones running without integration, and it moved the air, and it made the compound sensor arrays produce readings that Friday flagged with notations that had never appeared in the system before, and it left, when it was done, a courtyard and a compound and a morning that was still a morning. Thanos was still standing. So were Goku and Gohan. The silence that followed had the specific quality of a sentence that has been building for a very long time and has just reached its period. Thanos looked at the gauntlet, at the three remaining functional stone housings in a matrix that could no longer coordinate their output into the integrated system that the snap required. At the two beings across the courtyard from him who had done this had come through everything he had built and designed and deployed with 6 weeks of the most comprehensive preparation he had produced in 30 years of work, and had arrived at this moment still standing. He looked at Goku. "What you did," he said, "with the Soul Stone, the calculation was still running, still trying to fit the event into a framework that could process it. Your Kai, it reached back. It interrupted the output through," he paused. "Through what?" "Through being itself," Goku said. Thanos was quiet. "Your calculation," Goku continued, with the same unhurried, uncomplicated directness he brought to everything he had decided mattered enough to say. "It treats power as the primary variable, measures everything in terms of what it can do, how much output it produces, what threshold it can exceed." He looked at the gauntlet. "But what I am isn't a power output. You can't measure it, you can't contain it, not because it's too strong." He met Thanos' eyes. "Because it's not power, it's just me." Thanos looked at him for a long moment. "That," he said, "is not a sufficient basis for a universal framework." "No," Goku agreed, "but it's a sufficient basis for this." He looked at Gohan. Gohan looked back. The Kai connection between them ran at full, clear, uninterrupted frequency. The 30-year background signal of a father and a son, present and complete, and exactly what it had always been. The specific thing that no calculation had ever successfully modeled, and no stone had ever successfully contained, and no strategy built around separating them, had ever fully accounted for, because the connection wasn't between two power outputs. It was between two people. "Gauntlet," Gohan said quietly. He was looking at the three functional stone housings in the fractured matrix, at the Power Stone and the Space Stone and the Soul Stone running at partial, uncoordinated capacity through an integration architecture that had lost 2 of its 6 primary structural elements. The matrix is fractured, 3 housing units destroyed or destabilized. The concurrent operation is offline. He looked at Thanos. "The snap requires full integration. You can't execute it." Thanos looked at the gauntlet. He did not respond, because the response would have been confirmation, and Thanos did not confirm things that were accurate when the accuracy served the position of those who had made them accurate. But he did not deny it either. The courtyard was quiet. Steve Rogers came through the main entrance at a run, having been running since the eastern wall came down, running the perimeter, running the tactical coordination, running the calculation of his own about when it was safe to re-enter the courtyard and what the re-entry would find. He stopped at the courtyard's edge and took in the scene with the fast, comprehensive assessment of a soldier who had learned to read aftermath. The destroyed wall, the flattened grass circle, the gauntlet blazing incoherent output, Thanos standing in the center with the specific, unprecedented quality of absolute conviction, encountering the beginning of a question it could not finish. He looked at Goku and Gohan. They were standing. He let out a breath that had been held for a variable amount of time, that he was not currently in a condition to calculate, and focused on what came next. What came next was Tony, arriving at Steve's shoulder with the Mark L running a full sensor sweep, and Friday producing output that was going directly into the tactical record, and would be reviewed approximately 100 times in the coming weeks. What came next was Natasha, taking position at the perimeter with the quiet, efficient economy of someone who had assessed the engagement's current state and identified the specific contributions available to her. What came next was Wanda, with her scarlet energy present and her attention on the gauntlet's incoherent output, with the specific focus of someone who understood stone energy at a level most people in the room didn't, and was making real-time assessments about what that incoherent output was capable of. What came next was the question of what happened to Thanos. It was Goku who asked it, not in the way of someone posing a tactical question about asset management, threat elimination, or the strategic implications of allowing a defeated opponent to withdraw. In the way of someone who had spent 30 years of fighting, arriving at the end of a fight and standing in the specific, complicated space that existed between the ending and whatever came after it. "What do you do now?" he said. Thanos looked at him. The question was not what he had expected. The calculation had not modeled this specific, open, honest question asked without strategy or subtext by a being who had just dismantled his second gauntlet and was standing in the wreckage of his most comprehensive preparation, and was looking at him with the same clear, direct, uncomplicated attention he had brought to every moment of the engagement. "I recalculate," Thanos said. "The answer's going to be the same," Goku said, not triumphantly, with the quiet certainty of someone who has checked from enough angles to know. "The resources thing, the scarcity, you're right that it's a problem." He paused. "You're wrong about the solution. Removing half of everything doesn't fix a problem with how things are shared. It just makes the problem smaller until it isn't." Thanos was quiet for a long moment. "You are a warrior," he said finally, "not an economist." "Yeah," Goku said, "but I've been to enough planets, seen enough of what happens after." He held Thanos' eyes. "The ones who survived your snap, they didn't suddenly figure out how to share better. They just had half as much grief." The courtyard was quiet. The gauntlet's incoherent output was dimming, the stone's individual outputs dropping as the disrupted matrix failed to maintain the energy supply the stones required for sustained deployment. The power stone's violet-white faded toward something merely present rather than blazing. The space stone's blue steadied into the quiet, resting luminescence of something that was still there, but was no longer being asked to do anything. The soul stone pulsed. Once, with the specific, slow, deep rhythm it had when it was not being deployed as a weapon, but was simply being what it was, aware, ancient. The stone that understood cost better than any of the others because cost was the thing it had always dealt in, had always required, had always extracted with the patient, absolute certainty of something that had never needed to be asked twice. It pulsed, and Goku felt it, felt the specific resonance of the stone connecting momentarily with his Kai, not reaching, not extracting, not the aggressive consciousness interface of its deployment a few minutes ago. Just contact, the acknowledgement of one thing aware of another. He felt in the contact the memory. Not clearly, not with the full, vivid detail of the memory itself. It was not that kind of contact, not a restoration. The stone did not give back what it had taken, but he felt the shape of it, the outline. The specific, warm presence of something that had lived in the part of him that organized everything else around itself, that had been there as background signal. The way Gohan's Kai was background signal, present and continuous, and so fundamental that its absence had been felt not as loss but as wrongness. He felt its outline, and he understood what it had been. Not the content, the quality, the specific, irreplaceable quality of a moment when he had been nothing but a father, not a fighter, not a Saiyan, not a warrior or a champion or a variable in anyone's calculation, just a man beside his son in afternoon light, present without purpose, being only what he most essentially was. He stood in the courtyard with the outline of it. That was enough. It was enough to know it had existed. To know, even without the content, that it had been the thing the soul stone had determined was most essential, that of everything in him, the stone had reached for that. The moment of simple presence, the afternoon that had required nothing of him except to be there. He looked at Gohan. Gohan looked back. Something moved in Gohan's expression, recognition, the specific recognition of someone who has been carrying knowledge that another person doesn't have, and has just seen the moment when the other person arrives at something adjacent to it. Not the memory, something that was shaped like it from the outside. He looked at his father and felt the 30-year Kai connection running at full, clear, uninterrupted frequency between them, and thought, this is what the stone took, the moment that made all the other moments make sense. And then he thought, but the other moments are still here. And the Kai between them was still here. And that was the part the stone couldn't take. "Dad," he said quietly. Goku looked at him. "Whatever it was," Gohan said, "it doesn't matter. I remember enough for both of us." Goku looked at him for a long moment. Something moved in his expression, the specific, full quality of a man receiving something that he hadn't known he needed, and finding that the receiving of it was exactly sufficient. Not the memory, what the memory had been made of. He smiled. The full smile. Thanos watched this. Watched the two of them, standing in the courtyard wreckage with the gauntlet dark at Thanos' side, and the mourning present around them, and the specific, complete quality of two people who had just been through everything that could be thrown at them, and had arrived at this moment still in possession of the thing that the Soul Stone had identified as most essential and had failed to take. He ran the calculation one final time. The result came back the same as it always came back when these two were in the equation. Insufficient data. He looked at the gauntlet, at the 3 dark stone housings and the fractured matrix, and the 3 remaining stones running at partial, uncoordinated capacity through integration architecture that could no longer support the function it had been designed for. He looked at the compound, at Steve Rogers and Tony Stark and the others arrayed at the perimeter with the specific, load-bearing quality of people who had been watching an engagement they couldn't fully contribute to and had stayed anyway, present at the edge of it, holding the perimeter and the comms and the tactical record and the specific human function of bearing witness to something that required witnesses. He looked at Goku. "You will not always be here," he said, "not as a threat, as a statement of what the calculation always eventually produced when run far enough forward, the actuarial truth that everything was temporary, that every variable had a duration, that the equation continued after the variables changed. The dimensional rift that brought you here was an accident. Accidents do not repeat by design. When you are gone." "Someone else will be here," Goku said. Thanos looked at him. "That's the thing about this universe," Goku continued. "Every time something shows up that's bigger than what they can handle, someone figures out how to handle it." He gestured at the compound, at the Avengers at the perimeter, at the specific, ongoing, magnificent stubbornness of beings who had been losing for most of their history and had never once decided that losing was the same as being done. "They do that. It's what they do." He paused. "The answer to the problem you're trying to solve isn't taking half of everything. It's these people figuring out something better." He looked at Thanos with the clear, direct, completely unperformed certainty of someone stating what they know to be true. "They'll get there, if you stop interrupting them." Thanos was quiet. The boom tube opened behind him. He did not step through it immediately. He stood at the threshold for a moment, the mad titan, the most comprehensive intelligence the calculation had produced, standing at the edge of the aperture that would return him to the space where recalculation happened, looking at a courtyard where 2 Saiyans from another universe stood in the wreckage of the most complete preparation he had ever made, and were still, somehow, composed of the same substance they had been composed of when the boom tube first opened. He looked at Goku one final time. "You are a very strange being," he said. "Yeah," Goku said, "I get that a lot." Thanos stepped through the boom tube. It closed. The courtyard was quiet. The specific quiet of a place where something has completed, not ended, not resolved, not tied into the clean package that satisfying endings prefer, but completed in the sense that a phase completes, that a chapter completes, that a specific configuration of circumstances reaches a point past which it cannot maintain its current form. Goku exhaled slowly. Gohan sat down in the grass. Not because he couldn't stand, he could stand, would be standing again in a few minutes with the same functional capability the 6 weeks of training had built, and the 2 power stone blasts had temporarily reorganized but not eliminated. He sat down because the grass was there, and the morning was there, and the compound was still standing, and his father was still standing, and the specific, continuous, uninterrupted background signal of that fact was, in this moment, sufficient reason to sit in the grass and let the morning be what it was. Goku sat beside him. They sat in the recovering grass of the eastern courtyard in the morning light of a universe that was not theirs, in the aftermath of the second engagement, with a being who had spent 6 weeks preparing to account for them, and had arrived at insufficient data for the second consecutive time, and did not speak for a while, because the not speaking was doing something that speaking would have interrupted. Tony came through the gap in the eastern wall, stopped, looked at the 2 of them sitting in the grass with the specific expression of a man who had run 17 simultaneous analyses of the engagement, and was in the process of arriving at conclusions that would require significantly more than 17 analyses to fully process. He sat down on a piece of courtyard debris. He did not speak either. Steve came and stood at the edge of the grass. He looked at the gauntlet, at the dark, fractured housing sitting where it had fallen when Thanos stepped through the boom tube, the 3 remaining stones quiet in their intact housings, the 2 destroyed housings present as the record of what the morning had accomplished. He looked at it for a long moment with the eyes of a soldier taking inventory of a field. Then he looked at Goku and Gohan. "He'll come back," he said, not as a question, not as a worry, as the honest, direct acknowledgement of the thing that was true. "Yeah," Goku said. "3rd time," Steve said. "3rd time," Goku confirmed. Steve nodded, the nod of a man filing information in the place where plans were kept, adding it to the ongoing inventory of what was known and what was required, and what the next period of time would need to be organized around. The nod of someone who had been fighting long enough to understand that the ending of one engagement was the beginning of the preparation for the next one, and who had made peace with that understanding long enough ago that the peace was genuine rather than performed. He looked at the morning. "We'll be ready," he said. Goku looked at him. At the specific quality of Steve Rogers saying "we'll be ready," the absolute, undecorated certainty of a man who had been saying some version of that sentence for his entire adult life, and had never once said it without meaning it completely. "Yeah," Goku said, "we will." Beside him, Gohan opened his notebook. He found the page he had left it on. "What comes next?" "Everything." He looked at the 2 words for a moment. Then he turned to a fresh page and wrote at the top of it in the careful, precise handwriting his mother had insisted on, "3rd engagement, what we know," and began.